Hello, I'm Devin, and you're listening to the 7th episode of Pioneers, a series of conversations with the designers, engineers, and inventors who are shaping computing as we know it. Today, I'm talking to Jonathan Blow, a video game designer best known for creating Braid and The Witness. He's also working on a new programming language called Jai, which is aimed at building high-performance video games. Jonathan's games are very different from most video games. Both Braid and The Witness have a mind-expanding quality to them. Without giving too much away, when I played Braid, I kind of felt like I was developing a sort of sixth sense that I'd never thought about before. And The Witness is an exploration of the nature of epiphanies. For those familiar with constructivist philosophy of education, The Witness is probably the best example of constructivist learning I've ever seen. Both games are a very special kind of tool for thought, and for me, I actually find them much more impactful than most software that self-identifies as a tool for thought. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I've been really looking forward to this.
Hi, I'm looking forward to it too. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So, what's something you learned from playing or designing video games that you've brought into your day-to-day life?
And there's a little bit of a crossover probably with general engineering on this, but maybe video games gives you a special flavor of it, which is like just appreciation for the complexity of a system. These are very complex systems, right? And I think that games give you a little bit of a taste of what complex systems can be like. One particular game might not do a very good job of being something that generalizes, but when you've played hundreds or thousands and they're like smart, you start to see between the lines, right? You start to see the what complexity is like, and then if it comes to solving some difficult problem in the real world, you come to it, I think, with a little bit of a less naive viewpoint, and you can start proposing things that are to some degree competently aware of the complexity that you're attempting to tackle, right? So like on the internet these days, right? The internet is the classic infinite source of bad argumentation that we have now, right? And there's all sorts of people saying you should just do this economic thing, like obviously, right? And it's like, well, actually, like if anything should be clear, even just from the history of economics, it should be that you can generate unintended consequences very easily. And in fact, well, you can't really avoid them, right? And so I don't have any economics education, but I have an appreciation for how systems can evolve and generate surprising outputs, given small nudges in the parameter space, for example, right?
I think one of the reasons why it might be that way, and something that contrasts it from building a system like a video game, is that the people talking about these things don't actually have much of a feedback loop. When your uncle argues about politics at the Thanksgiving table or whatever, it's like the argument that he's having there isn't actually changing anything in the world. So he can say whatever he wants and like nothing kind of comes back and affects him. Whereas when you're building like a video game system, if you have a misunderstanding of how the system works, you like very quickly start to see the consequences of that because the game stops working
Oh
or
yeah.
maybe it crashes.
Yeah, and that's definitely in common again with engineering broadly, right? Like you could have whatever opinion you want about what's a good shape for a bridge, but like you'll find out if that's true or not when you try to build it, right? Does it stand? How well does it stand?
What are examples of unintended consequences that you've experienced when building a video game where you like tweaked some part of the system and then it came back and bit you later on?
This one is hard to explain to people, but there's an aesthetics of level design where they get uglier as you keep trying harder and harder to make something happen, right? Like, oh, I need to make the player do this and that and that. So I'm going to put these walls over here and these holes over here and barbed wire fence and whatever, right? There's a certain kind of beauty and magic that you can get from restraining the impulse to do that. And when something's not working out, you can instead say, what is this shape of this level, or what is this interaction of these few objects? What is it inherently contained that I can maybe bring out, I can tease out by shaping the level a little bit correctly, right? It's like a light, fluffy pastry. Like the lighter of a hand that you have in that, the better it is. And the more it's like, the more you're forcing people to do things or not be able to do certain things, the less good it is usually.
That makes a lot of sense. I recently moved into a new apartment, and so and I moved across the country, so I bought all new furniture. It's been surprising to me how much like just trying to solve for one little problem. Like I want to make it a little easier to hold my coffee when I sit on the couch, so I'm going to have like a little table that bends over the couch, suddenly that makes the room look a lot less nice.
I do think that all these things, they have a similarity to them. Part of the right making of things is considering the interaction of every element with every other element, right? And there are these invisible relations between things that are really the thing that you're managing when you're trying to make something beautiful. It's not about the things individually being beautiful, although that helps, but it's about them being together to form a composition, right? And that's part of why designing games is so hard because games have a lot of things in them.
It seems like one of the reasons why it's useful to have fewer things in the first place, because as you get that n squared exponential growth, it just gets harder and harder to do a good job. Like there's definitely instances of maximalism in design where people put a lot of stuff on the screen or in a house or whatever it is that look great, but that's a lot harder to do.
So I would say that modern aesthetics seem to trend toward minimalism, right? And on the one hand, there are good things about minimalism, but on the other hand, for example, going to computer UIs, I think most of them are really bad. Most of these minimal UIs, in basic functional ways, like I can't tell what's the active thing to click on the screen anymore. Like Apple has a reputation of being good at design or something, and they're good at making a physical object that feels precious, like the ring, and you're like mine, and you want to hold it. But like there's very basic things that are obviously wrong, like iOS icons standard that they enforce is like awful, right? And then for whatever, like iOS 7 or whichever was the one when they decided skeuomorphism was bad. That was a whole web designer trend for like a year. And like actually people need to know what things mean, and if you have some non-skeuomorphic way to do that, that's fine, but actually you need to connect to their brain in some way. You need to connect to what they understand, and there were all these attempts to do things that didn't do that. They were just like, you're supposed to know what this weird, like the iOS game center was like some circles, and like app store is like a triangle that's loosely in the shape of an A. It's just like, come on,
Well,
guys.
I think like the idea of minimalism, what is the minimal amount of information I need to put on the screen to express the thing I'm trying to express? But the key thing is like there is a minimum and it's not zero. And so if you just keep taking things away, sometimes it makes it actually just impossible to understand what's going on.
The cynical part of my brain is like, well, it's very obvious that if there's less stuff to work on, you have to do less work, right? That's the way that we're trending, is like everybody's on Slack all day and very few people are like doing real work. And so clearly we're going to trend toward minimal design.
It makes design easier to reach for people who haven't necessarily perfected the skill. I would include myself in this category, by the way. I'm not a designer by any means, but I can make something that looks fairly good to modern standards, because modern standards are like a white page, some like pretty nice typography, and that's about it. Like as long as you have that, it's like considered like a stylish, nice page.
So when I look at like an iPhone, what I notice is my brain's confused and it's hard to focus on anything because all of these rounded rectangles, like they defeat your silhouette recognition. You just see all these silhouettes that are the same rounded rectangles.
Do you experience something similar with video games where you like have a basic concept in your head, but then as you build it out, you realize like, like the specific things I built to try to express this concept don't quite work, or there's something awkward about the ergonomics, and then you iterate.
Like often, I have an idea and then I start doing it and that idea isn't as good as I thought it was for whatever reason, right? Because when I have an idea, it's very general in the beginning, like, oh, it'd be cool if a certain thing, right? And it hasn't, in that way, that the right making of things is about things interacting, right? This idea in my mind, I could sort of mentally simulate how it's going to interact with things, but especially if it's hard to think about and complex and has many aspects, I'm not very good at visualizing that, right? And so I start making it and then I can see what happens, and it's not as cool as I thought, right? So one thing that you can do is yeah, just iterate toward something a little bit better and then do that thing. But quite often I don't do that. Quite often I just say, okay, this is not the thing. But I try to learn from that cycle, like what it is that I didn't see in advance, and try to incorporate that into my process and then just sort of start the process over from the beginning, right? Because you might end up somewhere very different. So, like, there are puzzle types in The Witness, for example, on the little panels where you go solve them. There's a good probably a good 2 or 3 hours worth of gameplay that I did early on. It had slightly different meanings, or very different meanings for some of the symbols, and I thought it was really cool in principle. But like, and I did all the programming for it. I set it up in the game. It was playable, and then I was like, oh yeah, like this thing is playable in isolation, and it's maybe interesting. But then I see now that this exists, that it doesn't connect up to things that I want to do in the rest of the game. We still have that in source control somewhere, and I might release it for fun someday in the future. Having a self-critical eye is very important. I rub people the wrong way sometimes by being vocally critical of things. Sometimes people jump to conclusions like, oh, he wants to tear people down or just be mean to people or something. And it's like, no, actually, this is the same kind of eye that I put to my own work when I'm trying to make it as good as possible, right? You just try to look clearly at what is there, what is wrong, and how do you fix it.
I think that actually engineering is often misunderstood by people outside of it, not appreciating that there are a lot of different trade offs that you could make. And so you are making very creative decisions at every moment along the way.
Mm.
When you're building a bridge or you're building a piece of software, uh, there are so many different choices you could make that all interact with each other. And so you're making creative choices each step of the way to say basically saying what is important to me, what is important to the person who's going to use this, how much do I care about that. That's not really appreciated outside of engineering because people like look out in thinking like, oh, it's just an objective problem, just build a bridge so people can go across.
Most of the decisions that I make in programming are aesthetic decisions, because it's like, look, I've done a lot of programming. I've done things a lot of different ways. So when I come up with some functional requirement, like, hey, I'm working on this compiler, I want to make this particular thing that works this particular way. Okay. There's actually an infinite number of ways to make that happen, right? And those ways are scored, they can be scored among a lot of different dimensions. People try to approximate these kind of aesthetic decisions with, there's all sorts of books or, online pundits who will tell you what good programming style is, right? And actually, I think almost all of those are really painful and terrible, but they're good. Like if you're starting out and you literally don't know anything and you're trying to learn taste, then like, yeah, I mean, if what you would otherwise type is a giant terrible mess, then maybe start with these things. I think it's important for people to go past them, and like, because all these rules about what good programming style is, they have reasons why those are the rules that that particular person came up with, right? And what you want to do is internalize that reason. I think also there's just some kind of selective pressure about when you can say some simple rules, those are the things that transmit effectively. You need to be able to make fresh decisions using not just rules that somebody taught you robotically, but like using a design sense that is tuned for the current time and place. Being a living designer is like recognizing that context and responding appropriately. And sort of being a dead designer is, I just do the thing that I was taught. And here we go. And you don't like it, fine.
I think another aspect of, I'll say, giving good advice or or learning from principles that people hand down to you is realizing that a lot of principles are very directional. And so it's about like what mistakes was that person more likely to do than not. So for example, I'm extremely stingy with money to the point of like making myself unhappy. And so the advice that most people give to other people, which is like make sure you keep a budget, take care, like make sure you're not wasting money, is totally useless to me. In fact, like I need to hear the opposite advice. Like that's the advice that I need to hear, but that's not the advice that most people need to hear, I
Right.
think. You were talking earlier about how the structure of teams has changed over time. And one of the things that a lot of companies have experimented with is like a flat structure without managers.
Yeah.
How do you structure your team for the kind of work that you do?
Like, we're small enough that we don't have to be super hierarchical. It's like 12 people right now in the company, which is really not enough to do what what we're doing. But again, I like prefer to undercorrect on number of people than overcorrect, because there's this feedback loop where you hire more people and that means you need even more people, and it's harder to stay alive, and like all these things start happening. So on the programming side, I'm just sort of leading the programming, but also we hire people who uh, who are self-guided for the most part and who don't require micromanagement, in part because I want to actually still be doing design work and programming work and all this stuff, right? I don't want to be in a lot of meetings all the time talking to people about what they should be doing. And so that's actually a little bit bad because sometimes I end up not knowing about certain things that are happening and then I get upset that they happened. But for the most part, this has been successful in preventing us from straying from the nuance of the things that we're trying to make. Well, one of the other programmers has been in charge of designing the graphics engine for the new game, and I like vaguely talk to him about that once in a while, but for the most part I just trust him to do it, right? And he's working with a couple other people on that. On the art side, we have an art team leader who, like, again, I talk to her once in a while, and we sort of maintain this mental picture of what exactly we're trying to do and how we're going to go about it. But I don't even know that much of the details of process about like what you do in a 3D modeling tool. So there's a certain level of separation that I have from that process. And we just go forward like that. But there's not, in a larger company, you have very explicit levels of management at like multiple hierarchies and stuff. And I think if we were larger, I think that's better than trying to do the flat thing. No successful army in the history of the world was ever flat. And you have to like wonder about that, right?
Totally. I think flat can work better or worse. Like, so for example, I've read a lot about the organization of pirate ships recently. They had a captain and they had a quartermaster who had more power, but like they were democratically elected. And if they ever did something that they didn't like, the pirate crew could maroon them and put someone else in place. And they would do that frequently. But when they were in battle, there was an exception. If they were in battle, then suddenly the captain became absolutely in charge. What he told you to do, you must do no matter what, because you had to operate on very short timelines where there wasn't time for disagreement. You just have to move because otherwise you're all going to die or go to prison or get hanged. And so I think like it's also interesting to think about like what are the different moments where different types of structure might work better for some problems and worse for other types of problems.
Well, I mean, I'm sure. So the picture that I have in my head of a pirate ship, there's probably just like a lot of muttered alliances and decision making, like behind, like things you probably get very political between individuals very fast. Like there's one or two companies in the games industry that famously are kind of flat, and they're actually not. They do actually have ultimate leadership in the sense that you're talking about that can't be marooned, which is interesting. But also, like the idea behind being flat is like, if you have a better idea about how to do this particular project, you can like compete with that internal to the company and do your better thing. And then the better thing comes up, right? Or you can decide what to do. And in reality, though, like you need people to be on the same page. Like there needs to be consensus in order to make things happen at scale that require coordination between people. And if you have somebody that just says, look, this is what you're doing, right? You might grumble and disagree, but you at least know what everybody's doing, right? And like if that's not in place top down, then what you end up having is a lot of people politicking with each other. Like there's this way in which you think, oh, we're going to be flat so that we avoid this thing where you're politicking with the manager and you're trying to be like the manager's pet and get all the good raises and stuff. But from what I've heard of people who have worked in these kinds of companies, it actually just makes the politicking way worse because now you have to politic with everybody instead of one person, right? It is just this n squared number of political connections.
Yeah, and anyone can block something, and you have to convince them all. I think a lot of this instinct comes from people wanting to feel equal to each other, which I respect that instinct, and I feel it myself. But I think that that's something that is a little bit misplaced when in a company because it makes sense for a country or for a society because you can't choose. But in a company, you can choose to leave if you don't like the way that it's run. You can go to a different company and so it seems to me that like those rules should be different. Like, yeah, in a company, you structure it in the way that the person who started the company thinks that it will work most effectively. And if you think you have a better system, you can leave and go start another company that can either outcompete them or just do something else.
I agree with that. I mean, like context matters, right? It makes a lot of difference if you're like born into a situation and don't really have that much of an hour. Like if it would be very difficult and high energy to exit the situation, versus like, I mean, in California, if you're a programmer at a company, it's very easy to get a job at another company, right? And in fact, people do that. Like people think a good career arc is to switch companies every couple of years anyway. Yeah, I just don't think it's a good idea if you actually want to be good at things, because you never get super deep into understanding a particular thing, and that's actually valuable. That
You touched on your urge to underhire as opposed to overhire. If you're if you're opting for one or the other, you prefer to underhire. It seems like at big tech companies, they have a very opposite urge where all the ones I've seen seem to hire, in my opinion, like way too quickly, and as a result, it like dilutes the amount of context that people have. Why do you think large companies do that?
individual managers have an incentive to grow their own little fiefdom, right? You would think that at the scale of the company, its goal is to be efficient, but it's made out of all these individual cells, and those cells want to eat as much funding as they can, right, within the company, or that manager wants to get promoted. And if you managed 100 people, that's a lot more impressive than managing 12 people, right? And so there's all these incentives that push things to get big, but then the more people you have working on it, the more knowledge is distributed, the smaller a portion of the whole that each individual person knows, right, the less strong their understanding is. There's this feedback loop where now it's being built with degraded understanding. And so it's even worse, right, over time. It keeps getting worse. And because it keeps getting worse, A, it becomes harder and harder to understand. B, there's more fires to fight. You need people just who are just fighting fires all the time, right? So as companies get bigger, uh, they need to retain a shape. They need a more rigid structure so that people know what's going on and the company can be like governed successfully. So like process becomes more important, right? Like, okay, how do you raise a complaint? Like what's the process? It could be quite involved in a big company. Or like how do you establish contact with another group in the company to do like certain kinds of, I don't know, right? Every company has a lot of this stuff. And the more process you have, the more people spend time doing process, and the less they have spent and like doing the output work. There's just many, many of these things, and it's one reason why large companies are kind of unappealing to me. On the other hand, you kind of need people to do some classes of things, and as I'm thinking like, what do I want to do before I die? Maybe I want to try to do some things that are bigger. If I like ever figure out exactly what that is, I might decide to grow something, but for now I don't. Maybe sometimes like Google or Facebook, you find an absolutely massive reservoir and you can pump it out of there at like a very high rate, and then like, why wouldn't you grow, right? Because this money is just kind of coming at you. Like, and so there's this economic regime happening that is not, it's not the economic regime that we're used to thinking about, where like efficiency of production matters. Google and Facebook are not that concerned, obviously, with like how many engineers it takes to perform a certain task, because they just have this money supply, right? At some point, I think in the further future, once a lot of the low hanging fruit is gone and computers get applied to everything that we could think of, then maybe we'll be back in more of a normal economic system with these companies where like quality matters and all these things. But right now it just doesn't.
A lot of different things go into making a video game. Like, I'm not going to list them all, but money is one of them. Like, people who understand the problem, artistic skill, the list goes on and on. Of those, or any of the ones that I didn't list, what's the limiting factor for what you're working on right now?
I mean, it's really, so it's hard to hire good people to work on things. Like that's just, I think everybody agrees with that. And so we actually, it's harder for us to hire than I wish it were. Part of that is we're still in California for some reason, and we have to compete with companies like Google and Facebook, which like they don't care if they pay an engineer $500,000 a year, right? So they do that for people. Like Google pays people $500,000 a year that we would not even be able to employ because they don't do enough. Like, and so that makes it hard to hire people, because it's like if you can just go make that kind of money over there for not really doing very much, why would you work hard at this game company? And well, the answer is because you actually think that this other thing is more meaningful or more interesting, and you're not being profit motivated, right? But also because we're small, it's like, and we don't release games that often. It's like we're not top of mind most of the time. Like if somebody says, what game, I want to work in games, what game company should I think of? They think of like the bigger companies that have presence all over the place. And so it's hard for us, but we're managing. We've hired some very good people in the last year and a half, and hopefully that trend continues. So being good at hiring people is a skill, and we actually haven't tried very hard to build that skill. So we're actually not very good at it as a company right now. Like if we were a bigger company, I could justify hiring an HR department, right? And then it's their job to find the people, and hopefully you do a good job hiring your first HR person or whatever. But we don't have that much growth that we could justify having a person where that's their whole job, right? I don't like, in some sense, there are things that are easier as a company gets bigger, because like at some point you just resign yourself to saying, we're taking an industrial Model T production line toward this particular thing. We're just hiring good programmers now. We're not hiring, like right now, we want people who can do specific things, like very specific things for the couple of projects we're working on.
It's not clear to me that hiring an HR person, even if you could hire them for free and not spend any money on it, would necessarily solve your problem. Because, like, someone who does HR probably doesn't understand what it takes to build a video game certainly the way that you do it.
Yeah.
Um, and so they might just not bring you the right people. Like, I definitely found this even for like relatively straightforward, like web development technical jobs at past companies. Like, the recruiters like kind of don't know what that looks like. They see like, oh, they went to Carnegie Mellon, they're probably good, and that's
Yeah.
about it. And I think this comes down to an incentive problem, because I think if you were to ask the leadership of most of those companies, they would agree with you and say, "Oh yeah, we want to be finding the best people, even if they didn't go to college, or maybe even it's more likely." And a lot of those, like the leadership, often dropped out to start their companies. In a lot
Yeah.
of cases,
Yeah.
I think the issue becomes like when you have a recruiter, there's plausible deniability. It's like, if I hired them from
Oh
Stanford,
yeah.
like,
No one's going to
well,
fire you for hiring a Stanford graduate.
right, like, "Oh, it didn't turn out." Well, that's a surprise, versus, like, if you hire a 16-year-old, who's, like, brilliant and they end up having some issue, then, like, everyone's gonna be like, "Well, who hired this person?" So I think, as you get bigger, you end up in more of those traps, and, if you have a smaller company, then the leadership can just, like, make those decisions and be like, "Hey, you know what? This 16-year-old is brilliant, and they know how to do things that, like, no one else I know knows how to do." So, solve some of those problems. If you did have a pipeline of amazingly talented people and you had an infinite supply of them, and they just came in, then what would your bottleneck become?
Yeah.
If you could clone yourself infinitely and then like attach your brain somehow so that like all the different clones were using the same like hive mind,
Yeah.
and so basically you're just expanding the amount of work that you individually can do. What would you build?
I mean, it's pretty weird what I'm working on right now, right? Because I've been doing game design, and then as time goes on, I become more and more interested in how much of a mess that I see computing has become, broadly speaking. And so, one of the speeches that I want to do, maybe I'll do it at an event if events start happening again. Like the thing that I try to get through into people's heads, and people don't seem to appreciate this, is like most of what programmers do most of the time is waste right now. It's mostly dealing with complexity that doesn't need to be there, right? Either complexity made by their own company in their own product because they hired a bunch of people, who didn't coordinate well enough. Like that's everybody knows that story. But then also dealing with the underlying computing structure, which is a giant mess that makes you work way harder than you should to just do simple things. And in fact, things that people used to take for granted are now pretty hard. And that's a problem. Programmers are becoming increasingly inefficient on average. There are small pockets of programmers that are very productive. I think if you can work on your own code in an isolated environment, you can be very productive. But like as soon as you're on a big team that's dealing with an operating system and a web browser, and like some invisible routers somewhere on the internet that have very weird ways that they like to behave that you can't even see into. It becomes very messy very quickly. I interact with a lot of younger programmers, especially because I do streams, I do live streams where I program and all that. And programmers are depressed a lot of the time. And I understand that because I've been depressed a lot when I'm programming. And it's very easy for that to happen when you feel like most of what you're doing all day is just garbage. You're probably going to feel that way if you're self-aware in any way, right? Like if you're just banging your head against a brick wall all day, and then you eventually manage to do something and then it falls apart 2 weeks later, like you're going to be unhappy. So, so I guess if I had infinite ability to get work done right now, infinite work bandwidth, I would try to do that. I would try to do the simpler version of all of computing that's as capable as what we have today. Actually, it would be more capable because it would be faster and it would have an order of magnitude fewer bugs at least, and be easier for people to understand and easier for people to work with and all that.
I know what you mean in terms of that the depression. For me, it came in the form of guilt. In my first job as a professional software engineer, I remember just feeling really guilty that I wasn't more productive and they were paying me all this money and I was just spending all of my time like fixing a webpack configuration or something like that. Like not even
Yeah.
building something new, just somehow the build broke and I would feel like I wasn't doing my job. I'm not doing the thing that I'm here to do. And then it wasn't until after I did a few more software roles where I realized like, oh, this is like just the state of a lot of systems. And it's not just me.
A lot of things are like barely working because there are people behind the scenes doing that stuff all the time, right? And it's just not good. Like, look, we could be much more productive if we just stop it, right? And so, but the thing is, it is true. It's a very large, complex system. It's not very easy to change. However, like something like economics is complex because it involves the personal decisions that people make every day, and you don't know those people, and you don't know what they're going to do, and you don't even know yourself, right? So have fun designing that. But computers were designed by people. We actually designed all these things. Somebody somewhere knows how all these things work, although the proportion of people who understand any given piece is declining over time, right? And that's dangerous actually as well. But this was made by us and we can make it better. People have all sorts of ways of justifying the status quo, right? And I think there's sort of a team aspect to it, but I find increasingly this attitude that like these things were made, they're like the pyramids of Egypt, where like they were made by the forefathers, and who are you to say that they should be changed? And you should just live in these structures that were made, by previous generations because they were smarter than you or something. Like I hear that phrase sometimes, like the web browser was made by people who were smarter than me, is something somebody said to me in like a online argument. That's scary. Like once programming becomes, we live in these structures created by future generations that we are no longer able to build, that's a civilization in decline, right? That's it, or at least it's a civilization that has passed its glory days and can no longer do those things, right? Maybe it could stay in a steady state at some lower energy level, but that's never happened in history. Like things just decline eventually. And
Because
so
things
that
break.
doesn't, yeah, yeah. Like things break, especially a highly technological society breaks if it's not maintained. So going to like the Bronze Age collapse and some of these other famous historical societal collapses, what happens is you have people who are sort of past their glory days in some way, and they think that they're doing fine, and then some environmental shock happens, right? Or they get attacked by someone out of the blue that they didn't know existed, or both of those things happen at once, right? And then there's a stress placed on the society that it didn't expect, and it finds itself unable to respond effectively, right? And just things don't go well, right? Very few things really make me angry, but that kind of a thing does. Like when people make excuses for mediocrity that looks to me like it will lead to decline, that makes me angry because the stakes are so high. But most people don't seem to agree with me that the stakes are that high. So I don't know.
You touched on the idea of making things simple enough so that other people can understand them. And if you make them incredibly complicated, it makes them a lot harder to hand down. It reminded me of in high school, I worked on old cars. And one of the things I loved about old Mustangs is that they would leave the space around the engine a little bit bigger so that you could actually like stick your hands in and like get yourself dirty and figure stuff out. Whereas like something like the iPhone is like packed so tight that you really need to know exactly what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to like break something. What is an equivalent that we could be doing in software to like leaving a little bit more space in the engine bay that would help future generations maintain the software or grow the software in a good direction?
Yeah. Well, what I'm finding with the compiler, for example, because that's actually the thing that I'm coming at this with the most of this kind of attitude of transferring the knowledge as it goes on, because if I want this to be a successful programming language, at some point somebody else is in charge, right? And what I find when I'm working on it is, the feature set of the language is a little bit ambitious, and it makes some things really hard to do. And sometimes they're just really complicated and scary. And I come back to them later, like even a month after I wrote something. Sometimes I'll go back to it and I'm like, not only do I not understand what this is doing, but like I have a sinking feeling when I know I'm going to go look at that, because I just know it's going to be confusing, and I don't have high confidence that this really works and all these things, right? And if that happens to me a couple months later, what hope do I have of somebody else like having the same level of understanding? And that's the thing. There has to be a very high bar for this, right? Now, like I've been working on this compiler for 7 years. I haven't released it, right? And that is actually unheard of. I had a working compiler that had a very nice demo in the year 2014. It's on YouTube, right? People could see it. The typical thing to do at that time would have been to release it, and then people use it in its early state, and then you just sort of evolve it over time. But like I've observed that process has created a lot of messes, and I feel like, okay, I'm going to release it eventually, but the more that I work now to make the thing better, the more pain is saved eventually. We're doing things that are unheard of, like we've got a very complicated commercial quality game that runs in this programming language and graphics engine that does a great deal of work for every rendered frame and all these things. It's not like the hello world kind of stuff. Sometimes people they build their compiler in their compiler and they feel really good about that. But like, I don't know. That doesn't seem to me like a very good test. Anyway, what I found is that it's very revealing to me in some way that's hard to communicate, to see the difference between what was my best attempt at some functionality the first time and then what it is like the fifth time, and to see the difference between those things. On the one hand, I think by the time I have that fifth time version, it is much simpler. It's usually faster. It's usually more robust, and will communicate better to future people because I had experience now, right? Like when you start a project, I'm not an expert in that particular system. I don't know much about it. And so I have to gain the expertise, and the decisions I make early on are not going to be necessarily optimal. In fact, they'll be far from optimal because these decisions are made by someone who doesn't really know that much about what they're doing, whereas decisions made later are much better, right? And so I get what I'm trying to say is this mythical ease of use and productivity that people are talking about. I have seen it achievable on at least a small to medium scale, but it doesn't look like what people think it does.
You're using Jai in a very serious context of use. It reminds me a little bit of how Pixar designed Presto, which is their animation software. I believe Pixar originally was like building Presto so that they could sell it. And then they're like, well, maybe we should make a movie with this thing to like make sure that it actually helps us make a movie. And then they ended up becoming, one of the most famous movie studios in the world. Um, and they continued to develop it. I think it's still under development today, and it evolves with the movies. And every time they say, you know what, hey, like we really want to be able to make really realistic Scottish hair. Like, how do we do that? And that's like probably not something that when they first started writing the software, they thought that they would need to do that. And so real uses come up. And I think something that I have struggled with a lot in the software community is that I see a lot of like demo driven development, which is around like, how can we make a cool toy demo, like I don't know, a to-do list that like works really nicely on the screen and it looks really cool and easy to build. And if you're building a to-do list, great. And it like actually might solve that problem really well. But then it doesn't tell you if it's going to scale up.
It's about complexity of what you're trying to do with it, right? It's not that hard to make something that works well for toy problems, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
Which I think is also like a major issue with reviews of tools in general. Like anytime, I don't know, you look up what's the best note taking app or something like that. Someone's like, oh, I tried all of the note taking apps and this is the best. Like if you're trying that many apps, like you're probably not using them. Like I think you only know if something's good after you've used it for like 10 years. I'm not sure how to solve that problem because sometimes you just don't have that time. You need to make a decision, but it gets challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because it's kind of like what I said I do on games like The Witness, where like we don't really get to see it play out. We have to a priori design something that will be good when people play it. And there's always a little bit of miscalibration between what you think it's going to be and then what actually happens in the world. But, I find that with stuff like that, I usually can actually, at this point now, with the amount of experience I have, I usually can get it pretty close. Whereas early on, like when I first started doing games, which was like in the 90s, I had no ability to do that. My brain didn't really work that way. So somehow I absorbed it by doing a bunch of game stuff.
Are there any heuristics that you would be able to articulate that have guided you in a better direction?
You start with some ideas to make a game, and then you explore the consequences of those ideas. Well, how do you do that? Because you're in this multi-dimensional space where there's all these directions. You could start at one and then just keep drilling in some direction. And the problem with that is you'll go forever into tinier and tinier things. And so what you do is you like draw some boundary where it's like details of a certain size. We want to make sure we get everything inside that boundary that's of that size. So like those puzzles I mentioned before that I cut from The Witness, the reason I could cut them was it was kind of like a protrusion. It introduced an inconsistency, like I was saying, or you could hand wave it away, but it sort of was. But also, what became clear was sort of the center of gravity of the game. It was like sticking out way on the side. And it's like, yeah, we don't really need that part. Whereas if you cut out the middle, that's pretty bad.
That's really interesting image that you have in your head of like an n-dimensional object that has like sort of a center mass where a lot of things are clustered. And if things get too far outside of that boundary, you should like consider saying like, well, if it's really cool, maybe I'll expand what it should be in that center of mass, and like you
Hmm.
kind of do all the things in that outer ring.
Yeah.
I feel this way often when writing essays, where like every essay you write has an infinite number of things that are adjacent to it that you could talk about that are also interesting. And it takes really a lot of self control, which I do not do consistently, to like ruthlessly chop out the things that are not at the center of what you're trying to say. I think like one sort of release valve that people use is footnotes as a way to be like, I got to talk about it even though I know that like I shouldn't have put it in the essay, and so you put it in a footnote, and like
Yeah.
it kind of does the best of both worlds. Is there an equivalent to a footnote in a video game?
Yeah, sometimes. So with a puzzle game, one thing that I like to do is make allowance for different levels of engagement, right? So like with a book, you could read the footnotes, you could skip the foot. If you feel very completionist about the book, you want to read every single footnote, that's fine. So for The Witness, there was like, okay, we're going to have a level of completing the game that's like fine if you enjoy the game, but you don't feel particularly completionist about it, and you don't feel super curious about things that you've noticed. And if you've had enough with this game, then here's an exit point, right? But then things past that, and also just things out in the world that you might have to look a little bit harder to find, those are allowed to be more difficult because they're very optional, right? Like if so, a problem that games had going back earlier decades is they tended to be very linear in structure, and if that was a puzzle game, that meant that if you couldn't solve a particular puzzle, you could not get to the rest of the game after that puzzle. And that's very frustrating. That led to puzzles becoming fake in a certain way because it's like, look, we just can't strand people in the middle of this game. They'll get really angry. So we just have to make the puzzles easy enough that nobody will really have a problem with them. But it's not really a puzzle unless you might not figure it out. Right? Like like if you're guaranteed to figure it out, it's probably not that interesting.
One of the reasons you're able to do this in video games is because they're a spatial world, and people are making decisions throughout, as opposed to like a film or a book, which is very sequential and a guided experience from the author in a more like directed sense. What are the things that, by having video games be a spatial medium, what other things does that unlock from a design perspective?
You're sort of talking about what do I do as opposed to what an author does, right? Like I try to find what can this medium do and what kinds of things work in it. So some things about video games, right? I can't say. I think that's a kind of thing that games do generally is they put you like inside a system. Say you've got some website and it's got some graphs of like how would you handle COVID, and you have some budget to spend and you could like test people every so often or like have certain policies and whatever, and you could like maybe move some sliders and see the graphs go up and down and try to get there's some probably way too simplistic code that's running to like try to figure out the result. Like if you're twiddling these dials and like watching the results that happen, you're standing outside it, and then you have to somehow build with your own mind what it would be like what that whole system is like that you're just seeing tiny parts of. And games are continuous and good at iterating with different initial conditions, and just because you're acting in a way where you care about your decision and you see the consequences of the decision, it's just different from like twiddling a slider on a web page. Like, it is sort of the same thing, but it's actually really different experientially. So I'm a big believer that communicate complex things to people. Games are actually a good way to do that. But that kind of game would be, if we follow that line of research, you probably end up with something pretty different from what we currently have, from what most games are. And that's a big ability of or a big well of untapped potential that would be cool to play with.
I've read that one of the games you're working on will come out in episodic form, and that it might take as much as 20 years to complete the full series. Can you
Yes.
talk more about that?
So the prototype for this game I did while I was working on The Witness, because it's just hard to work on a big project for many years. And I found it good to have like a little side project that I don't have to be super serious about, because we're not like trying to get it done. Like, I don't, a lot of people are like, I go to my job and then I go to the bar afterward and hang out and have beers. And like, I don't really do that. I go dancing, but I program as a way to have fun too. um, and so this was like my side fun project, and it just ended up being a really good game. And I wanted to make it. So that was like around 2013, actually, that I started designing this game. But it's kind of been on the back burner for a long time. The aesthetic that I was telling you about before, about exploring a space of ideas, there's sort of different ways of doing that. Like Braid does it at a smaller scale. Like Braid is sort of a tight parallel structure where there's some number of worlds. Each world has the same number of puzzles. So they're like weighted roughly equal in importance, kind of. But then Witness is like, well, some areas have more puzzles and some areas have fewer puzzles. And it's more like, it's a little more sprawling and not that tight, but that was okay because is just doing a different thing. And then this new game it's about engineering a combinatoric explosion. So there's like a lot more interactions of rules in this game. Like by the time you're done with Braid or The Witness, you could like write down what the rules are. And if you wrote that down for this game, it would be way bigger than for either of those games if you write them all. Like this piece of this minute to minute gameplay is really fun, but I could imagine other things that are similar to this that are like a different activity, but could kind of fit together in the same universe somehow, right? And so you could release one game that's like this thing, like the game has like different characters in it and different, it's not actually a puzzle game, but it's got a little bit of a puzzle sensibility. So there are objects that you recognize and you learn how they behave, and then you use that understanding of that behavior to do what you want to do. And so you can expand the universe to have more of those objects, right? Or more kinds of locations for those behaviors to occur in. And so I kind of wanted to do it, the way like a fantasy or science fiction author will like write 27 novels in the same universe and like expand it out. And that seemed very challenging and interesting to think about, because it would be a place that nobody's really done.
It's like the rules that are related to each other, but they're not all the same, in a way that, like, I don't know, the Ender's Game books, like, all have a similar style and similar type of world, but you're not saying that it's the same characters or the same objects necessarily, but rather rules that kind of seem like they go together in a category.
Like I would want these things to actually interact at some level, but uh, still be kind of independent, right? Like the Earth and the Moon, they rotate around each other, but they're different bodies, like clearly, right? And you can do stuff on the Earth that you can't do on the Moon, like breathe. So, but on the
Minor
Moon, you could
details like
jump way
that.
higher. So,
Oh, that's interesting. And so you're thinking of it sort of like not the physics, because physics is the same on the Earth and the Moon, but like the basic facts, like gravitational pull, would be sort of like a rule set kind of thing. You touched upon the idea of sketching out the game at one point. What does it look like to actually prototype a game like the one you're building, or like The Witness? Like, is it literally a sketch, or was that a metaphor?
so there is this idea in the games industry of prototyping. It used to be considered a good idea. It probably still is, because games are complicated. It's hard to see what they are, like I was saying. So you kind of do something simple that lets you see what you're dealing with. used to think that was good, but I actually don't find myself exactly prototyping anymore. Like I usually find that I can throw the initial dart close enough to the target that like that can just become the thing. And so that's what I've done. So Braid, Braid was a playable game from the first week, and there's a direct continuity from that to the final thing that was shipped. It's like there wasn't like a separate prototype or anything. It just grew into the thing. And similarly with the Witness. So I don't know. Although that initial period of development is a little bit prototype-y in the sense that like there's very little there. You kind of have to make bigger leap decisions. Decisions cost less. You're not trying to hit any quality bar. You're just trying to get stuff in there, right? So it's more like it's kind of like if you would develop an outline of a book into like a final book or something. In fact, in the days when I started programming games, we were trying really hard to draw 3D, and you didn't have graphics accelerators that would do it, or you had early ones. You would construct your whole engine around like how fast the CPUs were, and then the rate of improvement of computers was much faster back then than it is now. And so like 2 years later, the design decisions that you made were no longer objectively the right ones to have a fast engine. Or like if you're rendering a smaller number of bigger triangles, then once people have faster computers where you can have more detail in the scene, like suddenly a lot of decisions change. There was a lot of writing and rewriting things because computers were changing. Like just even in terms of working, like I started my first company in 1996, and like we would buy new computers every 6 months for like several years because it's 30% faster than the one I had 6 months ago. Like that's just not a thing now, I mean, that was true for phones for a while, but even that's kind of stopped mostly, and so that's actually helpful in a way because things are more stable and you can make technical decisions with a longer horizon. I don't know how that is in the web world. I mean, my gripe about the web world is people keep making all these frameworks and stuff that people think are like technological advancements, but actually they're kind of just like splashing in place as opposed to swimming forward. And so there's this fashion of people changing what framework they're using, but it's like not really that much better ever, right?
Well, and usually it ends up being worse because then they have this like Frankenstein that is half
Mm-hmm.
one system, half the other. And so
Yeah.
then you have all of these like interactions. And so it's worse than either of the two systems would have been by themselves. And you always think, oh, we'll finish the transition, but like you don't. Like there's always like something that like you can't rewrite that easily, or someone doesn't know how, or
Yeah. Or, just you thought you would have time in the schedule to do it, but things took longer than you thought. And now you can't do it. But
I don't know. That
like,
never happens in software,
yeah,
to be
never,
honest.
never. But actually, I mean, part of the reason we operate without schedules most of the time is just to not have that problem. Like, look, we're going to rewrite this thing. That's just what's happening. The end. Like, it's just going to come out better. And yeah, it's 2 years later than we thought, but we're still going to do it. And that's something very few people seem to have the willpower to do. Even like Google's not going to run out of money anytime soon. Why don't they do more of that? But like, they don't.
Performance is something that you think a lot about when building software, and we haven't touched upon that too
Mm,
much in this
yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
I think like there's an intuitive answer to this question, which is like the question being, why does it matter? And or more concretely, like if the witness had had performance issues and it was like dropping frames, how would that have affected gameplay?
So different kinds of games, it matters more or less, right? So if you're dropping frames and having a stuttery experience like in an action game, that's very bad because the game is judging you based on your timing of when you do things. And like if that timing is hard to judge because like things are happening at inconsistent speeds, and like it thinks your button press happened later than it did because that happened to be a long frame when you press the button, then suddenly like the validity of the game is compromised, right? Because like it's judging you on things that are fundamentally unfair because it's not giving you the ability to like perform correctly, right? So Braid is a little bit like that because it's a little bit actiony. It's not really an action game, but like you do timing based things. In The Witness, there's very little in the way of timing based things by design, right? But like it's still the purpose. I was about to say something that's actually false. I was about to say, the purpose of a game is to have an enjoyable experience. That's not really true. Yeah, for a lot of people, that's true, but like I don't design things to be maximally enjoyable or whatever, right? As people who play my games know, sometimes they're frustrating and sometimes they do things that like clearly are not pandering to the audience. But okay, there's a few things. One is like if you're going to have hard puzzles, like imagine you're like in a mentorship program with someone and you really want to learn some things from them and it's hard to learn. and you have to work hard and it's difficult and you feel like you're not learning as well as you should and all these things. If the person's kind to you and really trying to help and you feel like they really have your back, it kind of makes it easier. You feel like you're in good hands. If they're mean to you and they kind of wish you would go away, or at least they present that attitude, or they don't really re-explain things, if they it's this is maybe a strained analogy, so let's back down from it. Like, that's something human beings are doing at all times when they walk into a novel situation, is like, what situation am I in? Right? And like, what are the parameters of that and how am I going to act in this situation? Right? And so games are especially touchy in that way, because games are like leisure activities. The game feeling smooth and responsive and high quality is like that, right? It's like, smartphones, like, they work hard on the materials and making the materials feel good. You're trying to build a cohesive whole where people feel like you cared about the thing that they are experiencing. Especially with puzzle games that get hard, people have this question, like, wait, I thought this would be the answer to this thing. Why isn't it? Is the game broken, right? Is the designer stupid? Or is there a good reason why this isn't the right answer that I haven't seen and that I'll be delighted when I see it, right? Well, the answer to that question is different depending on who designed the game. And like, you tell people that through the prior experience they had with the game, right? If you have enough buy-in with somebody, then they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. They'll be like, okay, I don't understand this, but I feel like this is a high quality experience, and I'm just going to understand that I don't understand right now, and we're going to come back to this later, right? Whereas if you don't get that buy-in, people will think your thing is broken or bad, right? And that's not, the things that I just said about people will think X. I don't think they really consciously have that as a voice in their head that they specifically say, but like, that's how people navigate the world. It's how they assess situations. It's a constant ongoing process. So that trust is something I take super seriously. But then there's also, and that's sort of a beginning to middle of the game. Like, but then, so if the point of the game is to create, I don't like to say create, I was about to say create experiences where you care subtly about what the experience is, but that's not really right, because I don't try to make specific experiences that people must have, but like, I try to create opportunities for people to maybe experience things that they wouldn't be able to get from somewhere else, and where those things might be meaningful to them or interesting to them, right? And when you are trying to do that kind of a thing, nuances of everything else matter, right? There's something like that where, like, if the game is stuttering and it doesn't respond to button presses correctly all the time, and like, you're not sure what you're looking at because like the graphics are disappearing in a weird way, and like whatever, like all these kind of technical problems that a game could have, it adds up to less precision of this instrument that you as a designer have to work with. I said very early on that I think computers make people unhappy fundamentally. And one of those is, there's really a deep sensory deprivation that happens. Like, most of your body is asleep when you're using a computer.
I feel like one of the things that we really lose out on by having that sensory deprivation you're talking about is that things in the world just like come with a lot of affordances. If you're cooking, you turn your back from a pan and things start to burn, like you get a smell. But there's all sorts of different types of interactions that you have with things in the world, not beyond just all the factory senses that
Yeah.
you don't get with a computer.
Yeah. And so that's actually another long term project that I would try to do, aside from recreating all of technology, be simpler, is, so I'm doing this compiler, right? And part of what the compiler does is it's supposed to be good at giving you information about the program and interfacing with external systems. And like, so programming is hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is it's kind of hard to understand what your program really is. It's kind of hard to see it all at once, right? And you see these efforts at like program visualization, and mostly they also produce things that are hard to understand and you don't know what they are, right? So it's like, hey,
Flame
we're just,
graphs.
yeah, we're making just this really giant spaghetti graph even for a very simple program, right? And so what I would like to work on, and we probably will do this at some point, is like program visualization, both for a static program, like what is it mathematically, and then also for a running program, like how does it behave, that just uses some of what we know from video games to make a more sensory filled experience. Like it's got audio, it's got visuals that are sophisticated in the way, like, you can see some 3D rendering from some very high budget games, and it's very sophisticated. Sometimes it looks almost photorealistic, but even if you're being stylized, there's just all sorts of effects you can bring to bear that your brain kind of knows what it is. Like your brain knows what haze and fog are, right? And you can like use that in an environment, and it knows what like light reflecting off a surface is. And the challenge is, how do you find ways to really use those to communicate in ways that are actually useful? That's actually really hard, because like you can make something visual that maps aspects of a program to those things, but like decoding that is not easy at all. Like as the user, maybe that's something that you learn to decode in ways. Like sometimes human beings learn to naturally do things that are pretty weird just because they're exposed to the stimulus a lot.
I've heard of like an ankle bracelet one of my friends had that it buzzed every time he faced north.
Yeah.
And so he like started gaining this like better sense of cardinal directions and started intuitively understanding the space. And like a buzz on your ankle is not something you would usually think is like going to be connected to cardinal directions, but once it happened enough times in his mind, like it started to build up that map. So I'm optimistic that you could sort of map arbitrary things to different senses, but I think it's better if it's less arbitrary ideally, because then you probably learn it faster.
Well, there's other really weird stuff. So like haven't checked up on this, but I heard quite a long time ago about devices for the blind where like you wear a camera, and then the camera has a readout that's like a bunch of pixels that just like press like either on your arm or like on your tongue, because your tongue's very sensitive. Apparently once you get used to that, it's you feel like you're seeing, sort of, right? Even though it's just
Wow.
this like abstract readout of sensations. I actually wonder how good those are now, because you should be able to drive the resolution higher over time and stuff. So people are good at adjusting to weird things.
I don't know that much about cognitive science, but from like day-to-day experience, I feel like there's a lot of examples of things where I thought I would never be able to understand this thing because I don't have like clear visibility to it, or it doesn't use like one of my senses that's normal. But then once you do the thing enough times, you start to build like an intuition for it, and there's some plasticity, and like it just starts to connect. But that's all like kind of magic words. Like every single word I just said is packed with a lot of assumptions that I don't really know how it actually works, but it does seem to work.
Yeah, and so I want to explore like, how do you do this with software? Like how do you somehow make information about the software available to people that their brain can intake? And if they don't require like years of training to understand it, then that's great. But even if they did, like even if you didn't get that much information out of it in the beginning, but then it built as you were exposed to the stimuli over time, that would still be a substantial advancement in technology from what we have right now, which is like nobody has any idea what their freaking program does, really.
Yeah. This sensory deprivation aspect of software was actually what originally attracted me to it. I wouldn't have phrased it the same way when I was younger, but like programming, I really liked how abstract programming was, and how like I in my head, and I could create like a whole little world of logic in my head that didn't have to like interact with anything in the real world. But I think that now that I've spent many years in that universe, I now have realized that I'm like missing out on being a more spatial creature and like actually being places. I read that you worked with an architect and a landscaper for The Witness. How did that change the way that you think that the way that you thought about the game world?
So we talked before about feeling in good hands, right? But they also have to kind of really be in good hands for this to work. Like if you make some puzzles and you say, haha, in order to see the clue that tells you the information you need to solve the puzzle, you need to go look behind this one bush that's on the other side of the island in a corner somewhere, and there's like no reason to look there, and it's not connected conceptually to this at all. That's a stupid puzzle, right? And not only will people feel like they're not in good hands, but they actually like will not be, and the game like won't really function, right? It won't be like a solvable puzzle game. So I knew that it had to be very clear about this. Like, you had to kind of know that you weren't really expected to go like really far in space away from where you were to try to find what's relevant, right? That's why each individual area has a strong identity, and architecture is part of how you establish a strong identity for an area, both interior and exterior architecture. So we actually, we had landscape architects who like helped us figure out what plants were where and stuff, right? And then the second thing was, okay, people are going to be looking around because some of these puzzles do involve the world that you're in. People are going to be looking really closely at that world. So it has to not fall apart under that scrutiny, right? So what a lot of games do, like 3D games, is it's hard to make all these 3D meshes and put them together. And so there's places where you're intended to pay attention to. And then if you go down the back alley and look behind some stuff, you'll see some things that are really sloppy, like geometry that intersects where it shouldn't, and low detail textures and all this stuff. And like I knew that for this game, if we were asking people to pay careful attention to the world, and then the world had to meet that expectation. It had to not fall apart under that level of inspection, right? And so part of what that means is everything had to be well built. There couldn't be any back alleys where like there's weird stuff. But it also just means if a building like makes sense at a scale where like I'm 50 meters away and looking at it, right? Then if I'm asking you to look carefully at the environment, that building kind of has to make sense if you're like looking under the porch, right? Putting those details in there, that's actually a significant amount of what the architects advised on, is like, what are the details of this construction, right? If you use this material with this material, how do they join? And that just gives it that level of detail where you don't feel like we as the designers did not bother thinking about this thing that you're doing right now. And again, I think most players don't consciously realize that, but it sort of pervades the experience and helps them feel like it's a high quality thing.
Cool. Well, I definitely could probably continue this conversation, but I do want to let you like live your life.
Someday maybe
So
we could pick it up again. Thanks. It's been
cool.
good.
This has been super fun. Let's wrap it up here.
Right.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Bye bye, everybody.